So I'm Natascha Radclyffe-Thomas and I teach fashion at the London College of Fashion. And my interest in creativity and kind of international and intercultural aspects of creativity really developed out of my own teaching experience. As you all know, London is a very multicultural city, and the universities in London attract students from all around the world and academic staff. And so when I was teaching in London several years ago, I became really aware of a bit of a mismatch between what people said and what they did in respect to creativity, and the assumptions that academics and students had maybe about students' creativity that were often based on kind of people's home countries. Then I was lucky enough to live in Hong Kong for several years. So I moved from London, I went and lived and worked in Hong Kong. And if you've had the opportunity to go and live in another culture, especially one where you're very obviously not of that culture, it really opens your eyes, you know, to your own culture. So when I was in London, I guess I was more aware of other cultures coming into London. When I went to Hong Kong, you start to question things, you know, about yourself, and when you're working and teaching, question things about how, you know, your students operate. Interestingly, when I was teaching in Hong Kong, I taught for a short while in a secondary school, and parents at parents' evening would say, my children aren't creative enough, or they're not creative. And it was just kind of interesting things like that I hadn't really experienced working in London. And then I was lucky enough to go and live in North America for a couple of years. And again, you know, when you're in London and you're in America, you might think that the cultures are quite similar, but again, you kind of have these little culture clashes. And I found often in the classroom, ways that I was working to encourage creativity, as I thought, were kind of unfamiliar to students and staff, and I was often accused of being European, which I took as a bad thing. Anyway, so that's kind of where my practical interest came from. And at the same time as all this moving around the world, I was studying for my doctorate in education, and the main point of that was about intercultural concepts of creativity and the idea of uncovering, you know, the implicit ideas of creativity. So this is where you come in and your bit of card, and I'd like you just to think of a creative person, can be someone, you know, known only to you or someone, you know, on the world scene, and just write a sentence about what it is that makes them creative, and it isn't a test. Okay, so you can keep scribbling if you wish, and I'll bring us back to that a bit later. But I've got a slide here showing, you know, some well-known creative people. It's interesting, we're talking about creativity, and the whole day is about creativity, and you have to sometimes stop and think about, you know, who is defining that creativity. You know, when you think about a creative person, often where I work, we're thinking about, you know, art and design as creatives. Other fields are thinking about kind of mathematicians and engineers as creative. You know, sometimes you're thinking about someone creative in your own kind of family or, you know, workplace, or other people who are creative on a world scene. Some people are creative, you know, in one area, and other people are creative in a whole range of areas. And so it's interesting to think, you know, in each culture, in an organisation, in an educational institution, you know, who are the gatekeepers of creativity? Who is defining and who is judging that creativity? So that's kind of a little bit of what I'm going to be unpacking in this session. And this I did some qualitative research at a London Art and Design university, and I spoke to students and staff and education managers. And whilst the topic of my research was creativity, I tried to approach the subject without mentioning that word, because I think sometimes when you say a word like creativity, it sparks so many different ideas and assumptions. So I tried to just ask people about how they worked. You know, I asked the students to tell me about projects they'd worked on, and I waited until people said the word creative or creativity, and then I would kind of tunnel down into that. If they absolutely didn't do that, then of course I would actually ask their opinion about creativity. And really interestingly, you know, one of the course leaders said, oh, it's one of those substances that isn't actually definable, which is very interesting to say. You're working in an art and design college and you can't define the thing that you want people to, produce. You're bringing people in. You want, you're saying this work is creative, but you're not actually being able to define what you mean. And so, this is happening in colleges, and this is happening in industry. And now, because the world is so interconnected and we're working in global teams and lots of the creative industries are very international, it's really important to think about what we mean when we say creativity. And there's two things going on in kind of design at the moment that I think are very interesting. And one of them is the kind of idea of the local, which is kind of a reaction to the whole kind of globalization. So we've had the kind of idea of the global consumer and the fact that we all want the same thing around the world and that brands are multi-global. But now there's a kind of idea about having the kind of heritage, which we've seen a lot in the last couple of years, particularly in British fashion, with brands like Burberry just playing on the history of the culture that goes into a product. And we've got two examples here. One's a Chinese fashion brand called Shanghai Tang. It's actually from Hong Kong, but they use Shanghai in the name to have all the kind of illusions of fashionability that comes with that. And then this campaign for Chrysler that was really, really successful. They debuted their ad in one of the big, Super Bowl matches, and they're kind of this idea of imported from Detroit. And you're seeing a lot of that in the US kind of design economy at the moment, the idea of kind of buying American and going back to those kind of roots of culture. And so it's interesting to look at how different cultures view creative products. So I've just got some quotes here. This is from some research on cross-cultural creativity. And it was looking at these two films, so The Last Emperor and Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, both of which were really, received great reviews in the West generally, Academy Award nominated, etc., etc. But actually Chinese audiences found them rather dreary, to say the least. So you can see, that in the black text, the Academy Awards, beautiful, majestic, and the red text is the Chinese reviews, not interesting, unrealistic. And so, it's interesting to see where we're getting those ideas and those clashes between cultures. And when at the London Olympics last year, which I'm sure we all enjoyed, there was a lot of talk and hype before the opening ceremony about how can we match the kind of creativity of the Beijing opening ceremony. It was seen as this great, masterpiece, and then the London opening ceremony came and went, and people really applauded. That's creativity. And the artist Ai Weiwei reviewed the London opening ceremony, and he picked up on something which is kind of at the centre of this ideas of cross-cultural creativity, about the individual and society. And he was saying that the London Olympic opening ceremony really focused in on the, on the individual, and that was kind of symbolic of the Western culture, whereas the kind of Beijing Olympics, it was all about kind of the mass and all about the kind of collective. And he was saying, the visuals that the cameras chose to show and the kind of montages, that was kind of the idea that's he recognised in, about the relationship between the self and society. So now what I'm going to do is do a quick romp through the history of, the idea of how creativity developed in the West and in the East. And at the outset of this, obviously, there are lots of differences within cultures, but Western ideas of creativity and Eastern ideas of creativity are, whilst they do share some, similar traits, they are fundamentally different and have come from, different roots. And I think it's interesting to understand that when we're looking at ideas of creativity, now and into the future. Okay, sorry. So I was going to say about this, the idea of creativity in the West has really, started with the idea, kind of the Judeo-Christian idea of kind of channeling inspiration from some kind of divine being, and that humans were just kind of doing God's work on earth. And this kind of notion of inspiration, continues, especially in my field when we're talking about fashion. People are often talking about a muse that they're inspired by. And the idea of kind of the individual in creativity really started in the kind of ideas of the Renaissance, and which kind of broke the idea of, this divine inspiration, actually put people at the centre of creative production. And that kind of remains, you can see Albrecht Dürer here in one of his iconic self-portraits. And that really remains at the centre, especially in art and design, of the idea of creativity being about the individual and, artworks expressing the self. And then with things, with things like Charles Darwin's, theory of evolution, came this concept of creative problem solving, which people are talking about today. And this remains, again, a fundamental part of the Western conception of creativity, is about not only problem solving, but problem finding. And so in the 20th, the kind of latter half of the 20th century, psychologists started analysing, working out, who is creative, how do we measure creativity, and kind of coming out of the idea of intelligence quotient tests, so coming out of the idea of IQ testing, became the idea that you could use psychometric tests to measure creative potential. So not necessarily whether people were creative, but their potential for creativity. And so this is an example of the Torrance tests of creative thinking, that these kind of figural and semantic tests developed in the 1970s, which are still the kind of most widespread, most widely used tests for creative potential. And they're used internationally, but developed in America. Now, I said earlier, the idea of the individual being at the centre of creativity in Western notions, but actually more recently with people like Csikszentmihalyi and Richard Florida, they've actually kind of developed more contextual ideas of creativity and actually thinking about the culture that you're in, the culture that you've grown up in, and actually the geography of creativity. And so Richard Florida developed this kind of idea, which he talks about in The Rise of the Creative Class, about certain areas attracting creative people. He talks about the 3 T's of talent, technology and tolerance. And if a location, generally a city, because he feels that cities are creative places, if they can combine these 3 T's, then they will attract creative types. He has quite a broad range of how he defines, what's creative industries, and then will build up creative capital. And he used this to kind of make a creativity map, first of all, of the states. And in his research, he found that San Francisco, he thought, was the most creative city. And this idea of measuring creativity with things like the Torrance test and things like Florida's idea means that we can make kind of comparisons, and people have made these kind of comparisons about which cities, which countries are more creative. And so Florida has extended his idea to make this kind of global creativity index and taken, these ideas of the combination of the 3 T's and literally ranked countries on their creative potential. And as we know, creativity is really at the forefront of a lot of government kind of policy. Innovation is at the forefront of, lots of investment, to get competitive advantage. And so this idea of saying, well, this country is a creative country, this one not so much, and almost making a recipe of how you can encourage that goes along with this kind of thinking. And so I'm not sure if you can see that there, but when he did his global analysis, Sweden comes out on top, followed by the US, got the UK down here at number 13 and Hong Kong down at number 20, just for some kind of comparison. And it is a lot more complicated than just these 3 T's, and there's a lot of information that you can look in the reports, you can find these online readily available and go into that if that's of interest to you. Not to be kind of left out of this, the EC has made their own kind of European Creativity Index. And interestingly, and probably not surprisingly, the European idea of creativity really embraces things like culture and history, the diversity of the population of Europe, and really looks at things like how museums, art galleries, and kind of the heritage of Europe can be its competitive advantage. And so they've you can see here that they've got their own idea of what they call a culture-based creativity, which highlights things like artistic skills and lateral thinking skills and the environment. So again, thinking about kind of the culture and the context in which creativity is fostered or hindered. And that's really the idea behind lots of the cross-cultural comparisons. They've really said that cultures, meaning national cultures, can foster or inhibit creativity. And those kind of ideas have really come from ideas about how the individual relates to creativity and the kind of Western ideas of what creativity means, which often means kind of risk-taking, making mistakes, and exploration and revolution and big change, because that has come out from where Western ideas of creativity have come from. But if we kind of step back a little bit and look at the concept of creativity from Confucian heritage cultures, which are the ones listed here, we see that the actual notion of creativity has come from a different place, and so the understanding of creativity may be different. And so the idea of creativity in Confucian heritage cultures, kind of the concept of the universe evolving is kind of from the interplay of yin and yang. It's much more about harmony and it's much more about evolution. And again, just to reiterate, you know, these are obviously vast populations in different countries, but they do share a cultural heritage. So, you know, please excuse me for making some generalizations in this presentation. Yeah, so the ideas behind kind of Buddhism and Confucian thinking are much more about harmony, about evolution, and about society and, you know, the collective rather than the individual. And this has come through a lot in education systems. There's often a lot of comparisons, especially at the moment, you know, where lots of these Confucian heritage cultures score very highly on international tests of things like maths and engineering abilities. And so, you know, Western culture often looking to see what it is. And one of the things that's often kind of critiqued in the West and maybe misunderstood is the idea of imitation and mimetic. So if you think about learning something like calligraphy, there's a lot of repetition, and lots of the ideas of creativity in Confucian heritage cultures are about learning from the masters. Not that we don't do that in the West, but there's this kind of idea of that there's nothing new to create in the world, that you're kind of adapting something that already exists, rather than kind of the revolutionary idea that we kind of hold in the West more often. So then that kind of leads me on to, well, is there a creativity divide? And I think, as I've alluded to, lots of cross-cultural comparisons of creativity have tried to say, well, this culture is more or less creative than the other, and give reasons for that. And there has been this idea that kind of the Confucian heritage cultures have been more kind of mimetic, have been copying the idea of Hong Kong R&D is replication and duplication. But these governments now are, especially places like Hong Kong, really focusing on the idea of creativity and maybe looking at these kind of Western models of creativity to see how they can innovate and change. And as I was saying, that, you know, the reason we need to think about this is because a lot of us are working in international global teams or you know, developing products for different markets. And one of the things that's at the core of the differences in kind of ideas, and this is particularly true with art and design, is the value of the product or the process. And so particularly in UK art schools, the process of how you get, you know, to your final product is very important. That's why we have sketchbooks. That's why you know, if you have an interview, that's what's looked at. We want to know how people think and how they've got to the product. Whereas the Confucian heritage culture is much more focused on the product. In an art school example, you know, you look at the finished product and you don't want to see how you got there, and that finished product wants to be perfect. And this has interesting implications for creativity if we think about taking risks and making mistakes. When I was doing my research interviews, you know, a lot of the students talk about making mistakes and how those happy mistakes can end up in something very creative. But actually in the Confucian kind of culture, a mistake is kind of a problem. Similarly, the word for question in Chinese is the same word as a problem. So asking questions, making mistakes is problematic culturally. According to Richard Florida's Global Creativity Index, we've got China here down at number 58, don't even get into the top 50. And he's talking about, because of these, you know, reasons that I've just been kind of mentioning. But somewhere like Hong Kong, which is actually trying to make itself a creativity hub in Asia, have kind of looked at this idea and said, well, hang on a minute, maybe your measure is not the right measure for us. And that's something that, you know, I think we can think about in a day like today, you know, how are we measuring things? And so when the Hong Kong government did this research, and they kind of thought about, well, maybe we can adapt. Okay, we understand that some of these ideas, and we agree with some of these ideas about cultural capital, but actually kind of the social capital in a culture like Hong Kong, which has much more of a collective basis, maybe that's something that needs to be highlighted if we're measuring our creativity. And so they've developed their own creativity index to think about a more appropriate measure for themselves. Now, something that can help us understand some of these cultural differences is the work of Hofstede, which was originally done with IBM to help people work, you know, interculturally. Because when we're working with people from different cultures or travelling in different cultures to work, you know, it's important to understand where people are coming from. So he developed these, what he calls dimensions of culture. And the two that I think are particularly interesting and relevant for the creativity are the ones I've highlighted here in the red, which are the power distance and individuality and collectivism dimensions. And the power distance is about hierarchy. So that's about, you know, how hierarchical the culture is in general. And if we think again about things like brainstorming and throwing ideas out in meetings, if you're in a non-hierarchical situation, that's quite easy to do. If you're in a very hierarchical culture, that is more problematic, because often if you're in a very hierarchical meeting, then the person who is the boss, they have the idea and everyone has to agree with that, at least in that kind of forum. So that can be quite difficult in terms of having meetings and brainstorming about creative projects. Individuality, collectivism is, you know, the idea of, whether it's the individual who is kind of the focus of society or whether it's the society as a whole, and how much responsibility you have to that, which in Confucian heritage cultures ties in with the concept of face, and so how you don't want to cause maybe one of your colleagues to lose face by disagreeing with their suggestions. So again, you can see in these kind of ideas that maybe I would find more familiar, to just throw out ideas and shoot them down, that might be problematic. And so again, if you're observing a kind of maybe a creative problem solving meeting with people from different cultures, you might be actually just misinterpreting what's going on because of some of these underlying dimensions of culture. What is very important to mention with this, though, as Hofstede himself says, this is, think about this as a field, not a flower, by which he means these are kind of, as the culture generally, this isn't something that you can just say, you're an individual from this culture, so you are like this. This is a kind of cultural general tendency. But it can inform, our decisions and observations about creativity. So when I was doing my thesis research, this is one of the questions that I was really interested in, and that's a question that I hope we can maybe have some conversation about in a minute, the question is creativity an internal cognitive function, which is really like the kind of divergent thinking test? Is that something that goes on in your brain? Or is it an external social and cultural phenomenon? Obviously no easy answers, but that was a question that I was kind of really interested in looking at in my research. And I'd like to kind of bring that back now to maybe what you've written down, and maybe we can have a little bit of a conversation about how we define creativity and what makes someone creative.